All right, before we get into all this, just know Chicago different. Street gang history out there ain't no side story. That's part of the city for real. And the men that came up in it, whatever else they was not small. There are two ways out of Chicago: prison or the grave, not a metaphor, not some after school special. That's the actual math of what happens when a city decides certain zip codes don't matter. When the factories shut down, when the money leaves, when the only institution still running in your neighborhood is the one built on loyalty and fear. South Side, West Side, Lawndale, Woodlawn. By the 1970s, those weren't just neighborhoods, they were closed ecosystems, and the men who came up through them didn't have the luxury of separating ambition from survival. Those were the same word. Every single one of them built something, every single one of them destroyed something. And in most cases, the same people were on both sides of that ledger. Thousands of people showed up to one of their funerals. One of them has a gang named after him, named by the man who ordered his murder. One of them is sitting in a federal supermax right now, and somehow Kanye West, Donald Trump, and the Illinois Department of Corrections are all arguing about the same name. 6 men, 6 different endings. Same city, same question. Did Chicago change, or did it just change the names of the people it leaves behind? Start with Bobby Gore. And before you say anything, yes, named after Frederick Douglass, with his family's own spelling of it. They had plans for this boy. What they didn't plan for was vice lords. Gore came up on Chicago's West Side in the 40s and 50s, a time when redlining wasn't a policy debate, it was just Tuesday. Black families were legally, systematically locked out of home ownership, locked into the most underfunded schools, the most neglected blocks. The city didn't hide it, it just called it zoning. By the mid 1960s, Gore had risen to lead the conservative vice lords, the CVL, and Gore meant the name. He went and got real money. By late 1967, the CVL had secured foundation-backed support for community programs, for storefronts, for the West Side. The CVL opened Teen Town, an ice cream parlor for neighborhood kids at 3700 West 16th Street. Right next door at 3702, they opened the African Lion, an Afrocentric clothing store on the same block, run by a gang. In 1967, on the west side of Chicago, a street gang opened a youth center and a clothing boutique with foundation money. That's not what the news covered. The news covered the bodies. There is footage of Gore from 1970, a documentary called Lord Thing, shot while the CVL was still running storefronts. He said in interviews from that period that the men around him were sick in the mind, not because of who they were, but because of what had been done to them, and the job was to reverse it. Teen Town wasn't a program. It was an argument that reversing it was possible. And then came the marches. 1966, Martin Luther King brings his Chicago freedom movement into the streets. The open housing campaign, pushing into Cicero and Marquette Park, white neighborhoods where the reception was bricks, bottles, and screaming crowds. The National Guard showed up, the Chicago police showed up, and the conservative vice lords showed up, standing on the line as march marshals, putting their bodies between King's people and the mob, a street gang protecting Martin Luther King on the streets of America. Bobby Gore said it plainly. This is a direct quote. Brothers, this is where you live. There's no place else to go that is not the same. So make what you already have a beautiful thing. If you succeed, then the system can't deny blacks nothing, because what he calls the worst of humans proved him wrong. Never forget, we are somebody. October of 1969. Outside a bar called the T-Box Lounge, 2 men were killed and one badly wounded. Bobby Gore was charged with the murder of Thurman Williams. He stood trial. He was convicted, sentenced on paper to far more than a decade, and ultimately released in 1979. He said from the day of sentencing until the day he died that he was framed. that the police, watching a gang leader become too legitimate, too organized, too politically powerful, needed him neutralized, that the conviction was the weapon. There was never a confession. There was never a witness who recanted. The court said guilty. Gore said framed. And neither of those things has stopped being true in the 5 decades since. The conservative vice lords were waiting, offering his seat back at the head of the table. He said no, because what he came back to wasn't the CVL he'd built. It was a drug operation. The storefronts were gone. Teen Town was gone. The argument he had spent years constructing, that the streets could be something other than what they were, had been dismantled while he was inside and replaced with exactly what he'd been fighting against. So he walked. He spent his final years working with a man named Benny Lee on a conservative vice lords exhibit at the Hull House Museum, the same institution where Jane Addams once fought for the city's most forgotten. Lee said Gore wanted to control the narrative about what really happens in urban America, preferably with the legacy of what they did in the 60s with the vice lords. He died February 12th, 2013, 76 years old, builder of something that no longer exists in the form he imagined, named after Frederick Douglass, convicted of murder. The two facts never stopped being true at the same time. Then came Willie Lloyd. Okay, out of all 6 men in this video, Lloyd was the one I really didn't know how to land. Not because the story is confusing, but because it goes somewhere you don't see coming. And where it goes is harder to sit with than the violence. Lloyd grew up in Lawndale on Chicago's west side in the 50s and 60s. By that point, the factories were leaving, Western Electric, International Harvester, taking tens of thousands of jobs out of the neighborhood, the kind of collapse that doesn't show up in history books. It shows up in the corners, in the storefronts gone dark, and young men with nowhere to be. Lloyd joined the unknown vice lords as a teenager. By the time he was done climbing and he'd reached the top and then declared himself above it, he called himself King of Kings, not king of the unknown vice lords, king of all kings, meaning above every vice lord faction in Chicago, all of them under him. Whether every faction recognized that claim is a fair question. What wasn't in question was what happened if you move product on his territory without permission. He built what you call a street tax system. Everybody paid, drug dealers obviously, but also street vendors, small-time hustlers, anyone moving anything on West Side turf under Lloyd's control handed over a cut. Refusal wasn't a negotiation. It was a death sentence. Now here's what gets buried in that story, and I think it matters. While Lloyd was locked up, starting in 1971, for his role in the killing of an Iowa police officer, he wrote a 61-page document by hand in a cell. He called it the Amalgamated Order of Lordism, a full organizational manifesto, command structure, chain of authority, how the vice lords should operate in prisons and on the street. 61 pages. That's not a thug scratching on paper. That's architecture. He did time from 71 to 86, got out, was back inside within a year on weapons charges, out again in 92, back inside on federal charges, out for good in 2002, 30 years cycling in and out. And when he finally came home in 2002, something had shifted. He didn't go back to the streets to reclaim anything. He went to ceasefire, where ceasefire, now called cure violence, treated violence like a disease. You don't arrest a contagion, you interrupt it. And who had more credibility on the west side of Chicago than the man who had been King of Kings? Lloyd became one of those interrupters. He lectured at DePaul University. He took sociology students through Lawndale on foot, walking them through corners he used to tax, giving them context that no classroom carries. Program advocates estimated that in the first year of ceasefire operations in his area, shootings dropped dramatically. Across Chicago, between 2000 and 2003, the program reported preventing hundreds of shootings. And then came August 21st, 2003. Lloyd was walking his dogs in East Garfield Park, mid-morning, unarmed, by every account no longer active. He was shot multiple times. That was the third attempt on his life. He survived. The bullets left him paralyzed from the neck down, quadriplegic, in a wheelchair, unable to move below the shoulders for the last 12 years of his life, and he kept working. He counseled the people who came to him after the shooting, the ones who wanted retaliation, and told them, don't. A man built on force, telling his own people to stand down. He moved to Minnesota a few years before he died, quietly, away from Chicago, away from the blocks, away from whatever remained of the life he had built and dismantled and rebuilt. He died in July of 2015. He was 64 years old. Cure Violence today operates internationally: South Africa, Iraq, Honduras, Trinidad. The model Willie Lloyd helped build on the west side of Chicago is now being used to interrupt gang violence in neighborhoods he never saw. The King of Kings never left a palace. He left a public health framework. Who shoots a man after he tells his own people not to retaliate? And then there was Fluky Stokes. They called him Fluky. And of all 6 men in this video, Fluky Stokes is the hardest one to write about cleanly, because he was genuinely 2 different people, and both of them were real. Start here. February 24th, 1984. Southside Chicago. Willie Stokes Jr., Fluky's boy, 28 years old, known on the street as Willie the Wimp, was shot dead on the steps of Robert's Motel. Here one day, gone the next. Fluky buried his son the way Fluky did everything, on his own terms, with no apology for the spectacle. The coffin was a custom-built Cadillac Seville, functioning headlights, functioning taillights, a steering wheel, a windshield, a vanity license plate that read WIMP. Willie Jr. was posed in the driver's seat, red suit, gray hat, diamond rings on every finger, with a fistful of $100 bills fanned out between his hands like he was counting a night's take at the end of a long shift. The funeral even inspired a song, Willie the Wimp, written by Bill Carter and later recorded by Stevie Ray Vaughan. 2 years later, November 18th, 1986, Fluky Stokes was killed inside a rented Cadillac limousine on a wireless telephone mid-conversation. His driver, Ronald Johnson, did not survive either. 2 Cadillacs, one for the son, one for the father. And the streets have a way of rhyming, and not in a good way. Now, to understand what happened 3 days after that shooting, you need to understand what Fluky Stokes actually was to the people on the South Side. Not what the indictment said, not what the DEA file said, what he was to the people who lived on the same blocks. He was not subtle about his money. Diamond cluster rings on every finger, stones big as silver dollars, gold bracelets stacked up both forearms, a diamond-studded letter F on a chain around his neck, silk suits in rotating colors. He dropped $250,000 gambling over a single weekend in Las Vegas. He did not own a car. He rented limousines. This was the 1980s. Most of his neighbors were surviving on government assistance. In neighborhoods, the city had systematically stripped of investment for 30 years. And Fluky Stokes walked those same streets as a living argument, obscene, visible, untouchable, that black men on the South Side could have wealth. Whether the method was acceptable is a separate conversation. The message landed. Someone close to him described his logic this way: the evils of the community were going to be there anyway, and he was going to exploit it as much as he could, but he was going to keep from being corrupt that which was pure. But here is what the prosecution files don't tell you. On the same afternoons, he was flooding those blocks with poison. He was finding new apartments for families burned out of their homes, reaching into his own pocket to keep someone from getting evicted. And multiple accounts describe him as genuinely generous with the elderly, the poor, the people with nowhere to go. Both of those things were true in the same man at the same time. Richard M. Daley, Cook County State's attorney at the time, said this after Stokes was killed. He has been a drug dealer for years. He has destroyed lives in the community. Daley was not wrong, but thousands still came to the funeral, and they were not confused about who Fluky was. They knew. They came anyway, because what you mourn is not always what you would have chosen. Sometimes you mourn the full, broken, contradictory thing that showed up when the city did not. November 21st, 1986, a R-Leak funeral home. Thousands filed past his glass-covered mahogany coffin. He was dressed in a sky blue suit, blue silk shirt, blue tie, and blue python snake shoes. On his chest, the men who dressed him placed a white portable telephone, the exact kind he had been holding when the shots came through the window. His mausoleum crypt, purchased for $40,000 in cash, was sealed with rose-colored Portuguese marble. The procession stretched 100 cars long through the South Side streets, and outside on the sidewalk, vendors were selling Fluky Stokes memorial T-shirts. Chicago has buried a lot of people. Nobody else had a merch table. His bodyguard, Earl Wilson, was charged with arranging the killings. Investigators found that Wilson had been working as an undercover informant for the Chicago Police Department and the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, and that he had agreed to set Fluky up in exchange for having his own debts cleared. Earl Wilson didn't pull the trigger. He sat in the car parked directly behind the limo and relayed the route step by step to the men who did. But hired guns don't move like that unless somebody higher up wants them to. Nearly 40 years later, Chicago still has an execution with no clean author. Then there was Mickey Cogwell. He left behind a name, January of 1969. Jeff Fort received an invitation to the inauguration of the 37th President of the United States, Richard M. Nixon. Jeff Fort did not go. He sent Mickey Cogwell and another lieutenant in his place, a black gang lieutenant from the south side of Chicago, walking into a presidential inauguration as the representative of an organization that federal investigators had been surveilling for years. Cogwell walked into those halls, shook those hands, and came back to the same streets. 8 years later, Jeff Fort ordered his murder, and the people who had been loyal to Mickey Cogwell did something that has no real precedent in the history of American street gangs. They named their organization after the man who had just been killed, not after the man who gave the order, after the man who was gone. That is not just loyalty, that is a verdict. Cogwell was the number 2 man in the Black P. Stone Nation's Main 21 Leadership Council, the governing body of the most powerful street organization on Chicago's South Side. And unlike a lot of lieutenants who stay in their lane, Cogwell moved in multiple worlds at once. In 1970, when the Chicago Police Department's Gang Intelligence Unit identified him as the primary link between Chicago's street gangs and the Chicago Outfit, the Italian organized crime network that had run the city's criminal infrastructure since Prohibition. He was the bridge, the man who could walk into a room with the mob and come out breathing. By the mid-70s, Cogwell was also organizing McDonald's workers on the South Side, pushing for fair pay and jobs the neighborhood depended on. Fort was building a myth. Cogwell was building a neighborhood. That same year, he and other BPSN leadership were under federal investigation for misusing over $927,000 from the U.S. Office of Economic Opportunity, money that was supposed to fund job training programs on the South Side. In 1972, Cogwell was convicted of federal grant fraud. After his release, Jeff Fort began restructuring the Black P. Stone Nation into a new entity, El Rukns, centralized, religious, at least on paper. Every lieutenant was expected to convert. Every subgroup was expected to dissolve into the new structure. Mickey Cogwell said no. Some accounts say there were no hard feelings, that it was a principled disagreement about direction rather than personal animosity. Whether that's true or not, on February 25th, 1977, at 3:45 in the morning, Mickey Cogwell was shot and killed outside his home on Sealy Avenue in the early hours of the morning. Jeff Fort ordered it. The people loyal to Cogwell didn't fold into other factions. They regrouped. They renamed themselves the Mickey Cobras, carrying his name forward into a future he would never see. In the years that followed, the Mickey Cobras ran free breakfast programs in Fuller Park before the Chicago public school system had comparable offerings. Neighborhood children got fed in the morning under the name of the man Jeff Fort had ordered, shot in the back. In 1985, Fort ordered another wave of assassinations targeting Mickey Cobra's leadership, an attempt to finish what he had started in '77. The Cobras survived. They remained independent. They are still operating in Chicago today. El Rukns is not. The FBI broke El Rukn as a major organized force. Jeff Fort is serving 168 years. He is in his late 70s. Jeff Fort built an empire strong enough to demand loyalty, but Mickey Cogwell's memory outlived Fort's redesign of that empire. So who really won that war? The man who gave the order or the man whose name stayed on the street? And that brings us to Jeff Fort. There is a moment from 1966 that I keep thinking about while writing this. Martin Luther King marching through Marquette Park on Chicago's southwest side, one of the most hostile stretches of American ground during the civil rights era, where white crowds had gathered to throw bricks and bottles and worse. Standing on the line around him, helping provide order and protection, keeping the crowd back, members of Jeff Fort's Black P. Stone Nation, a street gang protecting Martin Luther King by choice. 2 years later, when King was assassinated in Memphis and cities across America erupted, Woodlawn, Fort's territory on Chicago's South Side, was widely described as one of the few South Side areas that held. No riots, no fires. The Black P. Stone Nation kept the streets. In the worst night the movement had seen, Fort's organization was the thing that didn't break. That was 1968. Fort was also, at that very moment, running the numbers on federal money. The Black P. Stone Nation had secured over $1 million in U.S. Office of Economic Opportunity grants, war on poverty funds, for community programs and job training. The money went into the organizational infrastructure of the gang. In 1972, Fort was convicted of federal grant fraud. He served his time. He came back. By the early 1980s, he had rebuilt under a new name, El Rukns, centralized, a religious identity on the surface, using the Moorish Science Temple as framework and as cover for real estate holdings. Whether Fort believed any of it, prosecutors had a clear read. One federal attorney described it plainly. Fort saw an opportunity. That was total capitalism, not ideology. Fort told Congressman Bobby Rush from inside prison, "Use my name. Tell those youngsters to stop the killing." Then came 1985. Fort made contact with the government of Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. The proposal was specific. El Rukns would conduct terrorist attacks on American soil. In exchange, Libya would pay $2.5 million. Fort and his lieutenants discussed specific targets: infrastructure, transportation, and public officials. The scope was not symbolic, it was operational. On July 31st, 1986, an undercover FBI agent sold 2 El Rukns members a rocket launcher, non-operational, fitted with a tracking device. Price, $2,000. The case broke from there. November 24th, 1987. 5 El Rukns members convicted in federal court in what was widely described as an unprecedented case. American citizens found guilty of planning terrorist acts on domestic soil on behalf of a foreign government for money. Fort received 80 years for the conspiracy alone. Combined with drug trafficking and murder convictions, his total sentence reached 168 years. He had told a Chicago police officer earlier in his career, "Lumberjack, you ain't never going to put me away." He was wrong, though it did take the full weight of the United States federal government to prove it. Ford is in his late 70s. In 2023, he applied for compassionate release under the First Step Act. It was denied. Rukns does not exist. The FBI dismantled it through consecutive RICO prosecutions, took the building, took the members, buried the name. The Black Pea Stone Nation, which Fort built before Rukns and then tried to fold into it, still exists in Chicago today. The thing he tried to erase outlived the thing he built to replace it. Woodlawn, where Fort grew up, where BPSN once held a line for Martin Luther King, where his organization was once the most stabilizing presence on the South Side, is today one of the most economically distressed communities in Chicago. High crime, high poverty, decades of disinvestment. The neighborhood that held in '68 has been burning in slow motion ever since. Then there was Larry Hoover, 1964, Chicago's South Side. The leader of a street gang called the Supreme Gangsters is murdered. The organization he leaves behind has roughly 5,000 members. By his mid-teens, the man stepping into that vacancy is Larry Hoover. Whatever you think about Larry Hoover, hold on to that detail. The United States federal government required 17 years of surveillance and 40 criminal counts to contain a man whose leadership career began in the 8th grade. By 1969, Hoover had negotiated a merger between the Supreme Gangsters and the Black Disciples, two rival Southside organizations, creating the Black Gangster Disciple Nation with combined membership of roughly 15,000. He was still a teenager. In 1973, and at 23, he was convicted of the murder of William Young, known on the street as Pookie. The sentence, 150 to 200 years, Illinois State Prison. He never came home, but from inside, from county lockup, from state facilities, from increasingly restricted federal housing, and finally from ADX Florence in Colorado, the most secure prison in the United States. The organization kept growing, 30,000 members across 35 states. Federal prosecutors alleged the enterprise generated $100 million in annual revenue, all of it allegedly directed from a cell where Hoover was not permitted contact visits with his own family. The FBI spent 17 years on the RICO case. In 1997, Hoover was convicted on 40 federal counts. 3 additional life sentences stacked on top of the one he was already serving. Here is what gets dropped from most of the coverage. Larry Hoover entered the Illinois prison system unable to read. From the same cells where prosecutors say he ran a $100 million criminal enterprise, he earned his GED. Defense filings state he completed over 100 educational programs. He took courses in robotics, art history, a class specifically on Abraham Lincoln. His attorney said, and I'll quote this directly, he would have a PhD by now if that type of programming was available. In the early 1990s, he renamed the organization. Gangster Disciples became Growth and Development. He created the blueprint of the new concept, 6 principles built around education, nonviolence, and community organization. Prosecutors argued it was camouflage. Hoover argued it was genuine. That argument has never been resolved. In 1968, a young woman named Wendy Jenkins started seeing Larry Hoover. He was 17. She was the same age. 2 years later, he was arrested. 2 years after that, he was sentenced to more time than either of them would ever live. She kept visiting 3 to 4 times a year, every year, separated by glass for more than 5 decades. On January 9th, 2020, over 50 years after they first met, Wendy Jenkins and Larry Hoover were married in a ceremony at ADX Florence, Colorado. Through glass, she said, "I'm not going to stop coming down here until I die. I'm going to come and try to make sure he's doing okay. In October of 2018, Kanye West walked into the White House and spoke to President Trump about Larry Hoover. He said on camera in front of reporters, "In an alternate universe, I am him." In 2021, Kanye and Drake, two artists who had spent years in documented public conflict with each other, stood on the same stage in Los Angeles for the first time in their careers. The name of that concert was Free Larry Hoover. On May 28, 2025, President Trump commuted Larry Hoover's federal sentences. Hoover did not leave prison. A commutation is not a pardon. It does not open a state cell. His Illinois state sentence, the 1973 murder conviction, was not touched by the commutation. Larry Hoover remains incarcerated under the authority of the state of Illinois. He is in his mid-70s, and he has been inside for more than 50 years. The president signed the paper. The door did not open. If a man never leaves prison, but his name keeps moving through music, politics, prison boards, and the street half a century later, what exactly is still alive? The man, the myth, or the conditions that made him necessary in the first place? And that brings us back to Chicago. Thousands came to bury Fluky Stokes. The Mickey Cobras still carry the name of the man Jeff Fort killed. Larry Hoover's name still pulls artists, politicians, and prison boards into the same conversation half a century later. So maybe the real story was never just these 6 men. Maybe it was the city that kept producing the conditions for men like them, then acting shocked when they emerged. 6 men, 6 different endings. Same question. Did Chicago change, or did it just change the names of the people